The son who forgot his parents. The first time Daniel failed to recognize his mother. It was raining. Not a violent storm. Not the kind that rattles windows or floods streets. Just a quiet, persistent rain that blurred the world into soft gray lines. The kind that makes memories feel distant, even while they're happening. Margaret stood at the doorway of the small suburban house she had lived in for 37 years. Her hands trembled slightly around the casserole dish she had baked that morning. Daniel's favorite, chicken and rice with too much butter and too much love. She had made it the same way since he was 8 years old and refused to eat anything green. He was standing at the edge of the driveway, one hand on the trunk of his sleek black car. The engine was running. The rain dotted his coat, but he didn't seem to notice. "Daniel," she called gently, as if he were still that boy who used to scrape his knees on the pavement. "You forgot this." He turned toward her, polite, distant. The way you look at a stranger who might be asking for directions. "Yes," he said. The words slipped into her chest like something sharp and cold. She forced a smile. "It's Mom?" she said softly. "You left in a hurry." His eyes flickered. There was a brief tightening in his jaw. Not confusion, irritation. "I know who you are," he replied quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. I don't need it." She walked toward him anyway, the rain soaking into her cardigan. "You used to love this," she whispered. Daniel glanced at the dish, as if it were an unfamiliar object. That was a long time ago. Margaret felt the weight of those words press down on her ribs. Behind her, the front door creaked open again. Thomas stepped out. Slower than he used to move, his posture slightly bent with age. He carried an umbrella but didn't open it. He rarely did anymore. It was as if he no longer saw the point in staying dry. "Let him be, Maggie," Thomas said quietly. Daniel avoided his father's eyes. Thomas had once lifted Daniel onto his shoulders, so he could see fireworks better. He had taught him how to tie his shoes, how to ride a bike, how to shave without cutting his chin. He had worked double shifts for 15 years to put him through college. Now, he stood there like a distant neighbor. "Dade," Daniel said, but the word came out mechanical, habitual. Thomas nodded once. "Son." There was a pause that stretched too long. "I have a meeting," Daniel muttered, glancing at his watch. "I can't be late." Margaret lowered the casserole dish slowly, as if setting down something fragile inside herself. "Of course," she said. "You're always busy." Daniel didn't deny it. The rain grew heavier, tapping against the car roof in uneven rhythms. Daniel opened the driver's door, hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for hope to flicker in Margaret's chest. Then, he got in. The car pulled away without another word. Margaret remained in the driveway long after the taillights disappeared. The casserole dish grew cold in her hands. Thomas stepped closer to her, placing the umbrella over her head at last. He doesn't mean it, he murmured. But Margaret wasn't sure that was true anymore. Inside the house, everything still carried Daniel's childhood, like a quiet echo. The pencil marks on the kitchen doorway, where they had measured his height. The faded soccer trophy on the bookshelf. The small crack in the hallway wall from the time he had thrown a baseball too hard indoors. Memories clung to the walls like wallpaper that refused to peel away. Margaret set the casserole on the table and sat down slowly. Her hands rested in her lap, empty. "Do you think," she began, her voice fragile, "that he's ashamed of us?" Thomas removed his glasses and wiped them, though they weren't wet. "Is just changed. People don't forget where they come from." Thomas didn't answer. That night, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling. The rain had stopped, but the silence felt louder. She replayed the look on Daniel's face over and over. The polite smile, the slight impatience, the distance. She remembered a different face. A small boy with tear-streaked cheeks after his first day of school. "Don't leave me there again," he had sobbed, clinging to her coat. "I'll always come back for you," she had promised. And she had. Every time. Years passed quietly after that rainy afternoon, but something invisible had shifted. Daniel called less often. Then rarely. Then only on holidays. When he did visit, he checked his phone more than he looked at them. Margaret began preparing smaller meals. Thomas stopped mentioning the past in conversation, because Daniel would only nod absently, as though listening to a story about someone else's life. One evening, as autumn leaves collected in brittle piles across the yard, Margaret found an old photo album in the attic. Dust coated its cover, like a thin veil of time. She carried it downstairs carefully. Thomas was in his armchair, reading without turning the page. "Look what I found," she said softly. He glanced up, and for a moment, something warm returned to his eyes. "Our boy." They sat together on the couch and opened the album. There was Daniel at 3 years old, covered in birthday cake, grinning with 2 missing front teeth. Daniel at 10, holding up a science fair ribbon. Daniel at 18, standing between them in his graduation gown, his arms around their shoulders. Margaret traced her fingers over his younger face. "He used to hold my hand, even when he was too big for it," she whispered. Thomas swallowed. "He used to call me every night from college." They turned the page slowly, as if each image might dissolve if handled too quickly. Margaret's chest tightened. "Where did he go?" she asked. Thomas looked at the photograph of their son, smiling brightly into the camera, full of dreams and gratitude. "I don't know," he said. Winter arrived with an early frost that coated the windows in delicate white veins. The house felt larger now, emptier. On Christmas Eve, Margaret set 3 plates at the table out of habit. Thomas watched her from the doorway but said nothing. They waited until 9 o'clock. Then 10. At 11. Margaret finally put Daniel's plate back into the cabinet. "He must be busy," she said, though her voice barely carried. Thomas nodded, though he knew no meeting lasted that long on Christmas Eve. When they went to bed, Margaret left the porch light on. Just in case. Sometime after midnight, she rose quietly and walked to the living room. She stood by the window, staring at the untouched snow. Her reflection stared back at her. A woman growing smaller each year. She pressed her hand to the glass. "Please remember us," she whispered into the silent night. But the only answer was the sound of wind moving through empty branches. Morning came without footsteps in the hallway. Margaret had not truly expected Daniel to appear in the night, brushing snow from his shoulders, laughing at his own lateness. She had imagined it anyway. Mothers survive on imagined returns. Thomas found her still by the window at dawn, the sky a pale, fragile blue. The porch light flickered against the new day. "You should sleep," he said gently. She shook her head. "I kept thinking I heard his car." Thomas didn't tell her that he had listened too. They moved through Christmas morning quietly, as though sound itself might shatter something delicate. The tree lights blinked in soft colors, reflecting off ornaments Daniel had made in elementary school. Crooked stars cut from construction paper, a clay reindeer missing one antler. Margaret lifted the reindeer into her palm. "He cried when this broke," she murmured. "You glued it back together?" Thomas smiled faintly. He said, "It was perfect again." Margaret swallowed hard. "It's not perfect," she whispered. Thomas didn't ask whether she meant the ornament. Later that afternoon, the phone rang. Margaret rushed toward it with a speed that startled even her. She picked up before the second ring ended. "Daniel?" There was a pause. Then a voice. Familiar but distant. "Hey, Mom." Her breath caught. She pressed the receiver closer to her ear as if she might hold him there. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." "Yeah? Merry Christmas." His voice carried background noise, laughter, music, the clinking of glasses. "I'm at a friend's place. I meant to call earlier." "That's all right," she said quickly. "We were just relaxing." What Thomas stood a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back. "How are you?" Margaret asked. "I'm good. Busy. Work's been insane. But good." She nodded, though he couldn't see her. "We're proud of you." Another pause. "Longer this time." "Thanks." She waited for him to ask about them. To ask how her arthritis was, or whether Thomas's cough had improved. But the question never came. "I can't stay long," Daniel continued. "I just wanted to check in." Check in. As though they were an obligation on a list. "We understand," she said softly. "Okay. Well, I'll try to visit soon." "You always say that," she thought. "We'll be here," she answered aloud. When the call ended, the dial tone hummed like an empty room. Thomas approached slowly. He sounded all right. Margaret placed the receiver, back into its cradle with careful hands. He didn't ask about you. Thomas forced a small shrug. He's busy. Margaret turned toward the tree. The lights blurred as tears gathered in her eyes. I used to know everything about his day, she whispered. Every test score. Every friend. Every fear. Now I don't even know what city he's in half the time. Thomas wrapped an arm around her shoulders. She felt how thin he had become. Time did not rush after that. It thinned. Weeks slipped into months. Daniel's calls became shorter, then sporadic. Sometimes he texted instead, brief messages without warmth. Can't talk, in a meeting. Traveling. Maybe. Next month. Margaret began writing letters she never sent. She would sit at the kitchen table in the afternoon light, pen hovering over paper. Dear Daniel, I saw a boy today who looked like you when you were 7. She would stop there, unable to continue. The words felt foolish once written. She would fold the page and tuck it into the drawer beside dozens of others. Thomas watched her quietly from the doorway. More often now. One evening, he cleared his throat. Maybe we should visit him. Margaret looked up, startled. He didn't invite us. We don't need an invitation to see our own son. She hesitated. The thought both comforted and frightened her. What if they went and found a life that no longer had space for them? Still, hope can be persuasive. They called ahead. Daniel answered on the 3rd ring. Visit, he repeated, and something like tension edged his voice. I mean, it's not a great time. Work's crazy. We wouldn't stay long, Thomas said calmly. Just a weekend. There was a silence filled with unspoken resistance. I guess, Daniel said finally. If you really want to. Margaret's heart lifted at the word, guess, as though it were a gift. The city felt enormous when they arrived 2 weeks later. Skyscrapers pierced the sky, glass reflecting light like something unreachable. The air smelled of exhaust and hurried ambition. Daniel's apartment building was tall and cold, its lobby polished and impersonal. Margaret clutched her purse tightly as they waited for the elevator. He must be doing well, she whispered, trying to convince herself that success was enough. When the elevator doors opened on the 22nd floor, Daniel stood at the end of the hallway. He looked thinner, sharper somehow. His suit fit perfectly, his hair styled with precision. For a brief second, Margaret saw the child in him. Then it vanished. Hey, he said. She stepped forward and hugged him before he could react. He stiffened slightly before patting her back. Thomas extended his hand instead of embracing him. Daniel shook it. Inside the apartment, everything was immaculate. Minimalist furniture, neutral tones. No photographs. Margaret's eyes searched the walls instinctively. You've done well, Thomas said. Yeah, Daniel replied. It's comfortable. They sat on a sleek couch that felt too firm. Margaret pulled out a small tin from her bag. I brought cookies. Daniel smiled politely. You didn't have to. She placed them on the glass table. He didn't open the lid. That evening, they went to dinner at a restaurant Daniel chose. It was expensive and loud. Margaret struggled to read the menu. "What do you recommend?" she asked. Daniel sighed faintly. "Just pick something simple." Thomas noticed the impatience. Margaret pretended not to. Conversation faltered between courses. Daniel checked his phone repeatedly. "Is everything okay?" Margaret asked. "Yeah, just work stuff." She nodded, folding her napkin carefully in her lap. On the walk back to the apartment, Margaret reached for his arm the way she used to when crossing streets. He gently pulled away. "I'm fine, Mom." The word Mom sounded foreign in his mouth. That night, Margaret lay awake on the guest bed staring at the unfamiliar ceiling. The city lights flickered through the curtains like distant stars. She could hear Daniel moving in the other room, pacing while speaking quietly on the phone. I know, he murmured. "They're just here for the weekend." Just here. Margaret closed her eyes. In the darkness, she tried to remember the sound of his laughter as a child. It felt farther away than ever. Margaret did not sleep. She lay still, listening to the rhythm of Daniel's voice through the thin apartment walls. His tone was different, confident, efficient, almost sharp. There was no softness in it. No hesitation. No trace of the boy who once whispered secrets through his bedroom door because he was afraid of the dark. Sometime near dawn, the apartment fell silent. Margaret turned onto her side and stared at Thomas's sleeping form beside her. Even in rest, his brow was furrowed. His hand twitched occasionally, as though grasping for something just out of reach. She reached for his fingers and held them. In the morning, Daniel was already dressed. "I have to run into the office for a bit," he said, not quite meeting their eyes. "There's a situation." Thomas nodded. "Of course." Margaret forced a smile. "We can explore." "You don't have to," Daniel replied quickly. "There's not much nearby." The city outside the window suggested otherwise. Endless movement, endless noise. "We'll manage," Thomas said. Daniel hesitated near the door. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Guilt, perhaps. Or obligation. "I'll be back before dinner," he said. The door shut softly behind him. Margaret stood in the quiet apartment, unsure where to place herself. Everything felt temporary. They were guests in a life that did not belong to them. She wandered into the living room and paused again at the blank walls. Not a single photograph. Not from childhood. Not from college. Not even recent ones with friends. Why wouldn't he keep any? She asked quietly. Thomas looked around, as if the answer might be hidden in the corners. Maybe he doesn't like clutter. Margaret swallowed. Memories aren't clutter. They spent the afternoon, walking slowly through unfamiliar streets. Margaret clung to Thomas's arm, careful with each step. Cars rushed past without noticing them. People moved quickly, eyes fixed ahead. Daniel had once walked like that as a teenager. Impatient, always ahead of them on sidewalks. But he had turned back then. He had waited. At a small cafe. Margaret watched a young mother at a nearby table, wiping chocolate from her son's mouth. The boy laughed, wriggling in his chair. Margaret looked away before the tears could fall. When they returned to the apartment building, Daniel was already there. He was standing by the window, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, I understand the numbers," he was saying. "No, I won't let it slip." He glanced over as they entered, then turned his back slightly, lowering his voice. Margaret stood frozen in the entryway, as though she had interrupted something sacred. After he ended the call, he forced a small smile. "How was your day?" "Lovely," Margaret answered. Thomas nodded. "Big city." Daniel hummed absently. They ate dinner at the apartment that night. Takeout containers spread across the immaculate kitchen counter. Margaret tried to ignore how foreign the food looked. "Do you remember?" she began carefully. "How you used to insist on helping me cook?" Daniel paused mid-bite. "Not really." The words were casual, unconcerned. Margaret blinked. "You would drag a chair to the stove and stir the sauce." He shrugged lightly. "I was a kid." Thomas cleared his throat. "Those were good years." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Every year doesn't have to be about the past." Silence fell heavy over the room. Margaret stared at her hands. She had always believed memories were bridges. Now they felt like walls. Later that evening, as Thomas showered, Margaret stepped onto the balcony alone. The city lights shimmered below like scattered diamonds. Wind tugged gently at her hair. She heard the sliding door open behind her. "It's cold," Daniel said. "I don't mind." He stood beside her, though not too close. "You've built something beautiful," she told him. He gave a short nod. "It took work." "I know." And she hesitated, then spoke the question that had lived inside her for years. "Are we in the way?" Daniel stiffened. "What?" "Off your life." He exhaled sharply. "Why would you say that?" "Because you sound relieved when we leave." "That's not fair." Margaret turned to face him fully. "Then help me understand." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration rising. I have a lot going on. I can't constantly be pulled back." "Pulled back," she repeated softly. "To the past," he said. "To that house. To everything." Her chest tightened. "We are not everything. We are your parents." "I know that," he snapped, then immediately looked regretful. Silence stretched between them, thick and brittle. "You don't know what it was like," he continued more quietly. "Growing up there. Watching you both struggle. Dad working all the time. You worrying about bills. I promised myself I would never live like that." Margaret felt the words settle heavily inside her. "We did what we could," she whispered. "I'm not blaming you," he said quickly. I just needed to move forward. And moving forward means leaving us behind. Daniel didn't answer. Inside, the shower turned off. Margaret looked back at the city. I would have followed you anywhere, she said softly. You didn't have to run. He closed his eyes briefly, as if the conversation exhausted him. I didn't run. But the denial lacked conviction. The next morning, their suitcases sat by the door. Daniel had another meeting. Margaret hugged him again. This time he did not stiffen, but he did not hold her tightly either. Thomas placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Call your mother, he said quietly. I will. In the elevator, as the doors slid shut, Margaret watched Daniel grow smaller through the narrowing gap. He did not wave. The ride down felt longer than the journey up. At the airport, Thomas carried both suitcases despite Margaret's protests. You're tired, she said. So are you, he replied. On the plane, Margaret stared out the window at the clouds. I think, she said slowly, he's ashamed of where he came from. Thomas looked straight ahead. He's afraid of it. Afraid of us. Afraid of becoming us, don't? Margaret let the thought settle. The house felt colder when they returned. Dust had gathered on the mantel. The silence seemed thicker than before. That night, as Margaret unpacked, she found the tin of cookies, unopened at the bottom of her bag. She held it in her hands for a long time. Then she placed it gently in the trash. In the living room, Thomas coughed. A deep, lingering sound that did not fade quickly. Margaret paused. Are you all right? She called. I'm fine, he answered, though his voice was weaker than usual. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Outside, the wind moved through the empty branches again. And for the first time, she felt something colder than loneliness settling into her bones. Winter did not leave gently that year. Thomas's cough lingered long after the frost melted from the windows. It began as a nuisance, a rough interruption to conversation, a reason for Margaret to fuss and press warm tea into his hands. But as weeks passed, the sound deepened, turning hollow and heavy, as though something inside him was slowly collapsing. You should see a doctor, Margaret insisted one morning. Standing in the kitchen doorway, while he struggled to button his shirt. I've had worse, he replied, though he paused halfway through the second button to catch his breath. She stepped forward and finished fastening it for him. Her fingers trembled. You don't have to be strong all the time, she whispered. He smiled faintly. I've been strong this long. Wouldn't know how to stop. She wanted to tell Daniel. The thought came to her in quiet waves throughout the day. While folding laundry. While watering the dying fern in the living room. While watching Thomas fall asleep in his chair earlier than he used to. But when she picked up the phone, she hesitated. What would she say? Your father is fading. Would that sound like guilt? Like a demand? She put the phone down. Thomas finally agreed to see a doctor. when he grew too tired to walk to the mailbox without resting. The diagnosis came in sterile language, spoken gently but without hope. Advanced lung disease. Years of factory air. Years of overtime. Years of breathing in things no one warned him about. There are treatments, the doctor said carefully. But it's progressed. Margaret heard the words as though underwater. Thomas nodded calmly, as if discussing a minor inconvenience. In the car afterward, she gripped the steering wheel too tightly. "We'll fight it," she said. Thomas looked out the window at passing trees. "I'm tired, Maggie." The admission broke something inside her. That evening, she called Daniel. He answered after several rings. "Hey, Mom. I'm in between meetings." "It's your father," she said, her voice already fragile. A pause. "What about him?" Margaret swallowed. "He's sick." There was silence on the other end. Not shock. Not fear. Just stillness. "How sick?" Or she explained as steadily as she could. The tests. The prognosis. The uncertainty. Daniel exhaled slowly. Okay. Margaret closed her eyes. "I thought you should know." "Yeah. Thanks for telling me." His tone shifted into something more practical. "What are the doctors recommending?" Hashi repeated the treatment plan. Right," he said. "Keep me updated." That's all she wanted to ask. "Can you come home?" she said instead, the words slipping out before she could stop them. There was a longer pause this time. "I'll try," Daniel replied. "Things are complicated right now." Margaret pressed her lips together. "Of course they are." "I mean it, Mom." "I'll see what I can do." They ended the call without saying "I love you." Thomas watched her from his armchair. "He's busy?" Margaret said quickly, before he could ask. Thomas nodded, though something in his eyes dimmed. Days blurred into appointments and medication schedules. The house began to smell faintly of antiseptic and brewed tea. Margaret moved constantly, washing sheets, organizing pills, adjusting blankets. At night, when Thomas's breathing grew uneven, she sat upright beside him, counting each inhale as though her vigilance alone could keep him anchored. "Do you remember?" Thomas whispered one evening, his voice thin as paper. "When Daniel fell out of that oak tree." Margaret smiled faintly through exhaustion. "He cried more from embarrassment than pain. You carried him inside like he weighed nothing." "He was my whole world." Thomas looked at her gently. "He still is?" Margaret lowered her gaze. "I don't think we are his." Thomas reached for her hand. His grip was weaker now. "He'll come," he said, though it sounded like he was trying to convince himself. But Daniel did not come. He called once a week, then once every 2 weeks. His voice carried sympathy, but also distance. "I'm coordinating something at work," he explained one night. "It's critical." Margaret stood by the kitchen sink, staring at the dark window. "Your father asks about you every day." "I'll visit soon," Daniel said. soon began to sound like never. Spring arrived quietly, but the warmth did not reach inside the house. Thomas's body grew thinner, his shoulders sharp beneath his pajamas. He no longer made it to the porch. The mailbox remained unchecked for days. One afternoon, Margaret found him staring at the old photo album on his lap. "I was looking at this earlier," he murmured. She sat beside him. He turned to a picture of Daniel at 12, gap, toothed and sunburned, holding a fishing rod twice his size. "He believed in us?" Thomas said. Margaret traced the edge of the photograph. "He still does." Who Thomas didn't argue, but his silence felt like doubt. That night, his breathing changed. Margaret noticed it immediately. The shallow pulls, the long pauses between. She leaned close. "Thomas." His eyes fluttered open. "Call him," he whispered. Her heart clenched. She dialed Daniel with trembling hands. It rang and rang. Voicemail. She tried again. No answer. She left a message this time, her voice breaking. "It's time. Please." Then she returned to Thomas's side. "I called," she told him. He nodded faintly. Hours passed in dim lamplight. Margaret held his hand, whispering memories into the quiet room. Of their wedding day, of Daniel's first steps, of late night laughter when money was scarce but love was not. Just before dawn, Thomas squeezed her fingers weakly. "Tell him," he breathed. "Tell him what?" she asked desperately. But his eyes had already closed. Margaret felt the moment his hand went still. The house became impossibly silent. Outside, birds began to sing as if nothing had changed. Margaret sat beside him long after the sun rose. When the phone finally rang mid-morning, she did not rush to answer. It rang again, and again. Eventually, she stood and walked slowly to the kitchen. "Mom." Daniel's voice sounded strained. "I just saw your message. I'm booking a flight." Margaret closed her eyes. "You don't have to rush," she said quietly. There was a pause. "What does that mean?" She rested her hand against the wall to steady herself. "It means," she whispered, "you're too late." Silence crashed through the line. On the other end, Daniel stopped breathing for a moment. But the distance between them remained. Daniel arrived the next evening. Margaret heard the taxi pull into the driveway just after sunset. She was sitting at the kitchen table, still wearing the same sweater she had worn the morning Thomas died. The house smelled faintly of lilies now. Neighbors had brought them, whispering condolences at the door. She did not rush outside. The front door opened slowly. "Mum." His voice echoed differently in the house without Thomas's quiet presence absorbing the sound. Margaret stood. Daniel stepped into the hallway, suitcase in hand. He looked smaller somehow. The sharp edges she had noticed in the city seemed dulled by something heavier. "I came as soon as I could," he said. She studied his face. There were faint lines near his eyes she hadn't seen before. He waited. She replied softly. Daniel's throat tightened. "You said it was time. I didn't think." Her gaze did not accuse. That hurt more. He asked for you, she said. The suitcase slipped from Daniel's hand and hit the floor with a hollow thud. They stood there, separated by a few feet, and years of unspoken things. Where is he? Daniel asked finally, his voice barely audible. In the bedroom. Daniel hesitated before walking down the familiar hallway. His footsteps slowed as he passed the pencil marks on the wall. The ones that measured his childhood in inches. He reached the doorway and stopped. Thomas lay still beneath a white sheet, hands folded carefully across his chest. Margaret had combed his hair, back the way he used to wear it when Daniel was young. Daniel stepped closer. He had imagined this moment in abstract ways, someday far in the future. Not like this? Not now. Dad, he whispered. The word cracked. He sank into the chair beside the bed, staring at the stillness. Thomas had always seemed solid, immovable. A presence. Now he looked fragile, small. Daniel reached out and touched his father's hand. It was cold. He pulled back as if burned. I was coming, he murmured. I just needed a little more time. The room did not respond. Behind him, Margaret leaned against the doorframe, watching her son's shoulders begin to shake. For the first time in years, she saw the child in him again. The funeral was simple. Old friends from the factory came. Neighbors brought casseroles and stories. The pastor spoke about dedication and quiet sacrifice. Daniel stood beside his mother, hands clasped tightly in front of him. When it was his turn to speak, he almost declined. But something in Margaret's tired eyes stopped him. He stepped forward. My father, he began, then paused. He cleared his throat. My father worked harder than anyone I've ever known. His voice wavered. I used to think that meant he didn't have time. But he did. He always had time for me. A memory surfaced uninvited. Thomas running beside his bicycle, one hand steady on the seat. I let go because I thought I didn't need him anymore. Daniel continued softly. I didn't realize he was the one holding me up. The words hung in the air, heavy and late. Margaret closed her eyes. After the burial, the house felt unbearably empty. Daniel stayed. At first, it was out of obligation. There were papers to sort, accounts to close, belongings to decide upon. He moved through his childhood bedroom one afternoon, brushing dust from the dresser. The wallpaper was faded, the curtains thin with age. He opened the closet. Inside, neatly stacked on the top shelf, were boxes. Curious, he pulled one down. Letters. Dozens of them. All addressed to him. His name written in his mother's careful handwriting. He sat on the edge of the bed and opened the first one. Dear Daniel, I saw a boy today who looked like you when you were 7. His breath caught. The pages continued. Small updates about the garden, about Thomas fixing the sink, about how proud they were of him. None of them had been sent. He opened another. Your father coughed all night, but insisted he was fine. He doesn't want to worry you. And another. We miss your laugh in this house. The ink blurred as tears fell freely onto the paper. Downstairs, Margaret moved slowly through the kitchen, unsure what to do with the quiet. She heard footsteps. Daniel stood in the doorway, letters clutched in his hands. "Why didn't you send them?" he asked, his voice raw. Margaret looked at the pages, then at him. "You sounded busy," she said simply. He stared at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You thought I didn't want to hear from you." She gave a small, sad smile. "I didn't want to pull you back." The words struck him like a physical blow. "I wasn't running from you," he said. Though even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Margaret stepped closer. She reached up and touched his cheek, just as she had when he was small. "You were afraid," she said gently. His composure shattered. "I thought if I kept moving forward, I'd never end up stuck," he confessed. "I thought if I built something bigger, better, it would erase all the fear." "And did it?" she asked. He shook his head. The house felt different then, not just empty, but waiting. Daniel looked around at the walls that held his entire beginning. "I forgot," he whispered. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "You forgot to look back." He sank into a chair, overcome by the weight of it all. The missed calls, the unopened cookies, the final unanswered plea. "I can't fix it," he said. "No," she agreed softly. "You can't." Silence settled between them, but it was no longer sharp. Daniel reached for her hand. "I don't want to lose you too." Margaret squeezed his fingers. "Then don't." In the weeks that followed, Daniel extended his stay. He sat with Margaret on the porch in the evenings, listening to stories he had once dismissed. He walked to the mailbox for her. He cooked in the small kitchen, burning the sauce the first time and laughing quietly at himself. One afternoon, he brought out the old photo album. They turned the pages together. "This was the day you caught your first fish," Margaret said. "I thought I was a hero," he replied faintly. "You were." The grief did not disappear. It lingered in empty chairs and quiet mornings. But slowly, something fragile began to mend. Daniel installed a framed photograph of Thomas in the living room. The one from his graduation day, arms wrapped around his parents. He called his office and arranged to work remotely more often. He answered his mother's questions fully. He listened. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft gold, Margaret watched her son standing in the yard, staring up at the old oak tree he had once fallen from. He placed his hand against its rough bark. "I'm still here," he murmured, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to his father or to himself. Inside the house, Margaret left the porch light on again, not out of hope for someone to return, but as a quiet promise that no one would ever be forgotten again.